Welcome friends to the final session on multiculturalism. We were discussing that multiculturalism is something which is so very important in the modern world, and societies today pride in calling themselves as multicultural societies. But we also discussed that Western liberal democracies basically claim to be multicultural, but when you look at them closely, you would find that most societies are societies which have some kind of pluralism in operation, where the dominant culture or the culture of the majority dominates in the public arena. Multiculturalism actually is basically talking in defense of protecting minority cultures. It basically challenges the idea of universal rights of citizenships and talks about special rights for marginalized minority cultures. It is something, which the Indian constitution makers were very conscious of. And India was probably one of the first important democratic countries of the world which made provisions for special rights for minorities in the constitution, and that too in the category of fundamental rights. Now, those group rights, which are given in the Constitution of India, they are in addition to the universal rights which are given to citizens of India. And that shows, the concern of the constitution makers to give those special rights to the minority communities. And that also underlines the fact that they were conscious that these rights are required in addition to those universal rights. And that is the reason, why in the scheme of the constitutional framework, we find the minority rights come at the very end of all the fundamental rights which are given in the Constitution of India. Some of us might assume that since these rights are mentioned at the very end, that shows that they are of least importance. But actually, if one were to understand what lay in the minds of the constitution makers of India, one would understand that these rights would not have been mentioned anywhere else. They were best placed where they are actually placed in the constitutional scheme. Because when you talk about these minority rights at the very end of all the fundamental rights which we have got as citizens of the country, they underline the fact that these are the rights which are available to minorities over and above all the other rights which are already mentioned in the Constitution. So everybody, irrespective of whether you are a minority or majority, gets all those rights of citizenship. And then at the end, the Constitution says that the minority groups, for their protection, need these additional rights. So they are in addition to those universal rights. So by this very scheme, the Constitution of India actually speaks to us and actually agrees with the idea of multiculturalism, which challenges the idea that universal rights of citizenship are actually not sufficient for marginalized minority cultures. So that is the reason, why this scheme has been adopted by the constitution makers of India. In addition, multiculturalism also needs to be conscious of other actors in addition to the state that can be the source of minority marginalization. Because usually what we understand that if minority groups are marginalized, it is because the state actors are not actually paying attention to their plight, or they are themselves a source of marginalization. Means there is some kind of active policy or law enactment by the side of the state which ensures that minorities are marginalized. Of course, that is true. It happens in a lot of countries in the world. But in addition to that, there are other actors also, which are very important actors in the body politic of a country, which are a big source of minority marginalization. For example, the media, the way the minorities are depicted in the media, the way their caricatures and stereotypes are presented in the media, which create a certain kind of an image in the minds of the people about these minorities being inferior, these minorities being, dangerous to the country, these minorities being rather suspect as far as their patriotism is concerned, and many other, negative stereotypes are circulated, and they eventually become a part of common sense. And they become so strongly entrenched that not only the majority community, but even the minorities themselves, come to understand. They have some kind of a self-understanding, self-conception about themselves being what the stereotype or the caricature is trying to present. They start doubting themselves. So that is even more dangerous, when they start thinking that they have certain deficiencies in them and they need to be apologetic about themselves. And therefore what happens that many a time these minority groups or sections of the minority groups get actually withdrawn from the public sphere. So their participation in the public sphere, their presence in the public sphere becomes marginal or occasional, or sometimes they totally withdraw in the background. So that is something, which is inconsistent with the idea of multiculturalism, because it calls for providing a level playing field to all cultural groups in the society, and to ensure that there is a situation where no cultural discrimination exists in the society. So even we see in the so-called advanced democracies of the world that there are legal and political rights of equality which are given to all. But there are cultural communities which continue to be marginalized or discriminated against in the public space. They continue to feel that they are marginalized and discriminated, and there are ample evidences to suggest that that is actually something which is very real. The prominent example is that of African Americans in the American society. So the liberal democracies, would emphasize upon universal rights of citizenship. But at the practical level, at the operational level, this would lead to sustaining the dominance of the majority community. So what has actually happened in this society is that while identity-based discrimination, discrimination which is based on the identity of the person has actually reduced considerably, but communities still, they continue to be deprived in some ways, even in those liberal democracies of the Western world. So multiculturalism argues that sometimes promoting sameness may itself be a means of unequal treatment. So what they argue is that the eclipse of difference in the public space is a source of discrimination, because it eventually leads to cultural assimilation. What they are talking about is that they are arguing against uniformity in the public sphere, because it entrenches the hegemony of the majority. And this is what, as I mentioned in the previous section, that nation states in Europe did, that in the name of uniformity, what was entrenched was the culture of the majority. Because if in any nation state, it is stated or it is established that we will have a uniform culture, so it is quite obvious that that uniform culture, that sameness, will all emanate from the majority only. So therefore, for the multiculturalists, what is important is that there has to be difference in the public sphere. Different cultural groups want to retain their difference, want to retain their uniqueness, want to retain their wisdom which has come to them in the form of their cultural heritage through generations, and they don't want to assimilate with the dominant culture. So multiculturalism talks about cultural heterogeneity and diversity in the public sphere, but the heterogeneity and diversity should be underlined with equality among different cultural groups. multiculturalism also challenges the very basis of liberal democracies, and it believes that these liberal democracies, which although claim to be liberal, have not been able to truly ensure equal citizenship for all citizens. So they make all those claims. They are based on this basic claim of being liberal, of being free, but that kind of true equality as far as their citizens are concerned is rather something, which is still some distance away in these liberal democracies. And they emphasize that the kind of, as I mentioned, the negative stereotypes which are prevalent in the societies, everywhere in the West, the stereotypes about Turks, the stereotypes about Muslims, the stereotypes about Chinese, and about all kinds of people, who are coming from outside and who have come to live and even acquire the citizenships of these countries as a consequence of this interactive process of globalization. They actually show that these people or these different, cultural groups, to which these people belong, they are actually facing a very pervasive kind of discrimination as a consequence of this prevalence of all kinds of negative stereotypes which are pervading the public sphere in these societies. Another important argument against these liberal democracies which has been advanced by multiculturalism is that these modern European nation states, in their pursuit of creating a political community, actually led to the creation of image of us and them. So therefore what happened that the other cultures, or people belonging to other cultures were treated as them or outsiders. And therefore the majority or the dominant culture in those countries, did very little effort to understand the religious practices of other cultural groups. And they started treating those religious practices as actually a threat to their own cultural, framework. Because those cultural practices fell outside that frame, the frame which they had created for themselves. And in that frame, the cultural practices of the outsider did not have any space. A very important example can be given of the issue of hijab, in European countries, especially countries like France, where there was a ban on a hijab covering the face, and all kinds of controversy has been there in different European countries over the use of hijab. So now hijab is a very important cultural practices of people who have come from those societies and cultures where hijab is something which is a part of their identity, identity of women there. And many women, when they move out and go to these Western countries, European countries, even America, and they have been living there, many of them have been living there for decades, many of them have acquired the citizenship of these countries, but when they come in the public sphere using hijab, it is construed that they are polluting that public space. Now that public space, which is technically or at the level of argument, is free and open, is actually not that free and open for these minority cultural groups, because there are all kinds of restrictions, all kinds of, laws which have been made to restrict the use of hijab in different countries. And in several other countries where they are allowed to use the hijab, there are other non-state actors who have contributed to creating that kind of a negative stereotype, the social media, the mainstream media, and all the other actors, which have created a certain kind of negative stereotype, which makes it very difficult for the people who are practicing certain different things, like hijab, because they are looked down upon and people look at them with derision. Sometimes there is active, involvement of people whereby they are being physically abused and all kinds of things happen. So therefore, practicing their own cultural, things or practicing their own culture becomes some kind of a difficult, issue in those societies, and sometimes it becomes impossible for them. And therefore, what happens that sometimes you are cornered in a manner whereby you have no choice but to adopt the cultural practices of the dominant culture. And of course, all these things reflect the deep-rooted bias and prejudice that exists against minority cultures, even in countries of the Western world. Now, this historically advantaged position of majority community actually becomes an important source of discrimination. Because of their advantaged position, they think that whatever they are doing is sufficient for everyone. Because historically, that is what they have been doing. And sometimes they are not even conscious of the fact that what they are doing maybe sometimes inadvertently is causing discrimination to people belonging to other cultural groups. An example, which will illustrate this situation very nicely was the controversy or the book Satanic Verses written by Salman Rushdie. So you all might remember that when that book came out, there was a big controversy everywhere in the world, and also in Britain, because Rushdie was at that time in Britain, living in Britain. And a lot of people, tried to invoke the blasphemy laws in the UK against Rushdie, because they thought that many of the passages in that book were blasphemous in their nature. So when they tried to look up the laws, they found that the blasphemy laws in Britain only talk about blasphemy vis-a-vis Christianity. So if there is some utterance, some writing, some action in the public sphere against Christianity or Christ or the church, that is construed as blasphemy. But the blasphemy laws do not talk about any other religion, because when they were made, maybe hundreds of years back, or when they were made part of the statute in Britain, they had not visualized that they would need to deal with such situations where blasphemy laws would need to be invoked against people belonging to other religious groups. But till date, that it has not been changed. So how discriminatory it is that I am a British citizen and the other person also is a British citizen, but if there is some kind of a blasphemy happening, he can take recourse to the legal route by going to the court and filing a suit. But I can't do so because my religion or my religious beliefs are not covered by the blasphemy laws of my country, because that is now my country of which I am a citizen. So this is one of the many examples, which are there in all countries, of the Western world. And they are basically a source of discrimination against the minorities residing in those countries. So therefore, what happens that even these so-called free and open Western liberal democracies have a certain distinct cultural bias. And the cultural orientation of the nation state, places ethnic and cultural minorities at a great disadvantage in the public sphere. And they always find that things which belong to the majority culture, either it could be their food, their festivals, their dress code, anything, that is what is pervasive everywhere. So these minority groups can create small islands for themselves, small cultural islands, maybe in their localities, maybe in their places where they are living, and where some of them gather together and do their celebrations and do things the way they want. But in the broader public arena, their presence is very, very marginal. So they might contribute to creating some kind of a flavor of difference in the public sphere. But as we discussed earlier also, that difference or that appearance of difference is very deceptive, because it is very unequal, where the dominant and the powerful cultural group is all pervasive, all dominant, and its cultural practices are entrenched in the public arena. The multicultural scholars, use the examples of education and language policies to actually demonstrate, as we have discussed, how these modern nation states have a certain very distinct majoritarian cultural bias. So it's very obvious that all their language policies, their educational curriculum, the structures, the way education is rather imparted, the whole system has, of course, a very strong majoritarian cultural bias. And many a time, it is not even construed as something which is discriminatory, because that is considered to be something, which belongs to the country, which belongs to everyone, and that is the culture of our country and of our society. So, basically, what we understand out of this discussion is that the liberal societies actually have all through celebrated diversity. But that celebration of diversity has only been done at the individual level. But when it comes to culturing, means expression of diversity through a group, through a cultural group, then in those situations they are less accommodative towards difference of culture. And that is something, which is a very important source of conflict in the present world, and which impacts significantly the global politics today. We see in a lot of countries what is happening, that even if some kind of difference at the individual level is accepted or even tolerated, but when different cultural groups, want to assert themselves, assert in terms of retaining their difference, their identity, their uniqueness, the majority groups are not very comfortable with that. And that leads to conflicts. Sometimes it has led to bigger conflicts within the country, sometimes it has led to wars, and sometimes it has led to very serious consequences at the international level. It was basically a clash of cultures which led to the clash between the western and the eastern territories of Pakistan, and which eventually led to the creation of the state of Bangladesh. And there are many other festering wounds in the world where different cultural groups in different parts of the world are fighting for their own space, for their own cultural space, for their own political space, and that has created a lot of fissures in global politics. So multiculturalism is basically an idea which tries to create a certain kind of very positive and equal intervention in societies where people with difference, groups with difference, can live with each other in amity, and they need to live there while retaining, their unique identities, and they need to feel included and rather involved in that particular society and culture, because there is some kind of equal treatment to all different religious groups, different cultural groups. They are actually trying to create a situation where these forced policies of homogenization, which are forced sometimes through law, through policies, and many other times through the other actors, which create that kind of an atmosphere in the countries which force minority cultural groups to homogenize. That is a basic cause of conflict, which eventually leads to conflicts within societies, that is intra-state conflicts, and sometimes it also conflagrates into interstate conflicts at the broader level, disturbing international peace and security. So that is something, which we need to understand, because multiculturalism is an idea, is a concept which has a very close relationship with the issues of order, peace and justice at the international level. And that is the reason why we are talking about multiculturalism in our class of international relations. Thank you.